shortlist. Can you speak louder? Yes. Shortlist was, let's see, all the projects ran fine. I had to do one little tweak to get Maven to run. But both IntelliJ and Eclipse actually booted up off of it, which I was just floored. And the only big tooling in every project I threw at it ran fine. It went through the Maven builds fine. The only thing that I noticed was that there are the bytecode, ASM and bytecode, some of the bytecode instrumentation stuff isn't done yet on 8. So if you use anything that relies on that, like Cobertura or Jacoco for code coverage, that stuff's just horribly broken and doesn't work. So that's JDK 8 in a nutshell, 2-second version. Anyway, camera's rolling, so let's go get going. So, thank you for all coming. This is Greenfield Java in 2013. So I thought it'd be fun to do a little chat with you guys about what technologies you might use if you're going to start a project from scratch. So let's start out with, who am I? Iverson who? So I'm the CTO of Dynacron Group. We're a consulting company based out over in Kirkland, Washington. So all of our clients are local. So they're either pretty much all downtown or on the east side. We're about 40 people total. What we do is software projects with continuous delivery. So what that means in a nutshell is that we go in to do a project, and part of that project involves automating the pipeline all the way through. So requirements, builds, tests, perf, deployment, DevOps stuff, full lifecycle projects. As Malia mentioned, we are hiring. The stuff that we're talking about today, we have a GitHub account, so I'm going to show you guys a project that I'm doing, which is sort of a manifestation of some of this Bootstrap stuff. It's up on GitHub, which you can get to through our site. In addition to that, we do presentations, usually about one a month, and about 6 months ago we started videotaping. So if you want to go to our site, you can see presentations on delivery and all sorts of fun stuff. So in addition to doing consulting work up in the Seattle region now for about 10 years, with clients pretty much all the big names locally, we've also written some books and articles and stuff like that. Yes?
Did you take the James Whitaker book?
We did take that one. That was kind of sponsored that. We've been hosting events at our facility over at the east side. So when we do events, we can, because we have copyright on the stuff that we do, so we have to host it. So I don't know if James wanted us to. Okay. All right, so that's me in a nutshell. Okay, on to the presentation. So here's the scenario that I've pulled out of thin air. You've been assigned to do a brand new project. What tools, frameworks should you use for building that project? How do you decide? So the first thing, which we're not going to really go into detail here, is putting together a project charter. Right? What are you trying to accomplish? Who are the stakeholders? All that fun stuff. But we're going to skip that part and just go straight to, let's assume it's broadly speaking, a new consumer-facing web application. So a couple of things right at the top. They want to do a single-page web app. This whole request response stuff is old-fashioned. They say they want things like Facebook or Gmail or something. Also, they know that they're going to want to support a whole variety of mobile devices. So it's not just the iOS; it's also Android, Windows Phone, whatever. They don't even know where it's all going yet.
By etc., you mean BlackBerry.
Etc. Yeah, BlackBerry, right? BlackBerry fans. You pay $20 to make pull BlackBerry out and shows me what it wants. Okay, so here is, with that model, a basic architecture diagram, which you've all seen a million times, I'm sure. Persistence, business logic, web app, and then mobile app. Pretty straightforward. So we want to make a couple of assumptions right out of the gate. It's REST JSON, it's the interfaces between here and these. Persistence, I threw up a couple of examples. RDBMS, I'm not going to enumerate them all here. Mongo, as an example. Here's a couple of packages for business logic. Here's some stuff for the front. Any questions about this so far? Yeah.
Okay, so we're using XML, right?
Okay.
Because it's structured, there are schemas out there that are industry-wide, right? Use.
Okay.
Is there a JSON equivalent for that?
I don't know if a JSON equivalent to like a DTD or schema right now.
Well, not so much schema. Yeah, I mean, basically, if an industry's, I'm working at Boeing, so they've got their S1000D thing that they're doing.
Yep.
Is there? The industry hasn't embraced JSON that way.
Sure answer is I don't know, but I don't know one yet.
Ooh, JSON schema.
What we did at Windermere was we used Jersey, and since Jersey supports outputting either XML or JSON, the schema was published for the XML and the JSON simply matched it.
Yeah.
You're talking about the waddle?
Yeah, kinda, yeah, basically the model with all the key.
No, waddle.
I wasn't talking about model,
Okay.
I was talking about the schema, the XML schema.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, part of it to me is like, you know, there's this path, right, where it's like, you start out like SOAP started out as XML RPC, which was this dead simple, stupid, easy to use thing, right? And then by the time the standards bodies got a hold of it, it turned into this, you know, WS ** Frankenmess. And so, I don't know, I mean, I don't know why nobody has even put forward a proposal yet for a schema.
Well, they'll ruin it sooner or later, that's for sure.
Hey, it's an evening project to get started with. I think to a certain extent, JavaScript itself provides the foundations in terms of the types and stuff that are supported, so that just becomes a matter of documentation. So, I don't know, that's all I've got. Any other questions about this basic model that they kind of get? So one thing that I thought of, that I didn't put up here because I thought like a little bit of noise is a messaging infrastructure, like JMS kind of stuff. So I omitted that from this, just to be able to have something that we can go through and one.
I think it's gonna be testing and deployment stuff that's outside of the scope of what we're looking at here. Okay.
Yeah. So this is the next part, which would be every tier on here, right? Nowadays, we always build in with the premise of that we have a test strategy for dealing with things appropriate to this tier, right? So I was trying to think of, you know, if I'm working with an architect who doesn't think this stuff through, what terms would I use to describe the architect? And I couldn't come up with anything that would be Disney friendly. Yeah.
Do you think about native rendering, like something like Iverson, so you can actually run native widgets on the app, iOS?
Yes. So
Rather than just frames?
yes. So Appium supports running and installing. If you haven't seen Appium yet, it supports taking a native app, dropping it in seamlessly into a emulator that runs in the cloud, and then it also supports hooks to be able to drive it, kind of like Selenium. So it's a hell of a piece of tech. If you haven't seen it yet, I would check it out. It's still going to fire up emulators, so you get iOS emulators with different versions, and you can get Android with different images and different screen sizes and stuff.
I wasn't doing so much the testing, but more the actual application itself and the rollout. It's phone gap is HTML, right? So basically HTML.
Yeah, basically with PhoneGap you get a native project, which you can then, you get basically like a web view out of the box. So you can dump most of your stuff into HTML, JavaScript if you want. You can have a place to drop in additional things if you want.
Yeah, there are some frameworks that provide a native canvas which is actually native.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that tool. Honestly, I have PhoneGap up here, but if you look at like mobile development tools right now, that list goes on, you know, hundreds of pages. Part of like Titanium's one, then there's a bunch of other packages as well. Anyway, this is a Java group, so I was kind of figuring that the mobile native stuff I was going to leave out of scope for our frameworks conversation today, with the premise being that whatever is running here, we're going to be feeding it with JSON REST services. Make sense? So, cool. Any other questions about this basic concept? So, you'll note I have seeded a couple of these things with stuff that I would use today. Okay, so up here, this is a hypothetical again, smaller scale app, so I'm not necessarily looking at building them in here, but I might say Mongo, DropWizard, Angular, then PhoneGap for this. Does that make sense? Any questions? So this is basically the tiering step from the conversation we're going to have today. Okay. So this is how I figured that we'd tackle the conversation today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through these tiers and collect nominees. So we'll see what different platforms and stacks people like. And then for each tier, we're going to add a not sure, and we're going to vote. So if you're going to say today, this is what I would use. Then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take a few minutes to walk through criteria. And what I mean by that is the strategies that I would use when I would be trying to make these decisions. Because I go into clients and they ask me to walk through some of this stuff. So I'm gonna walk you through some of the criteria that I use. Then what I'd like to do is have people who are proponents for their frameworks or libraries of choice take a few minutes to stand up and talk about why they think that's a good recommendation. And I know a few of you, so if I get any volunteers, I'll call them. Then what we'll do is we'll take final vote and we'll see what the deltas were, right? So let's say that we start this off totally hypothetically, and everybody, we say, list a couple of frameworks, and 3/4 of you say, yep, I'd use Play 2, right? The final vote, maybe we've changed some minds. We do the vote again, and now 3/4 people say DropWizard. Totally hypothetical, see how it goes. And of course, we'll put that on the CJEC site, the end of the top for the historical view of what the winners were. So that way we have a snapshot in time, right? So of course that way 3 years from now we can go back, look at it, and be like, oh, I can't believe I picked that stuff. But at least it's a place to start. Does that sound like a good use of time? I also have a sample project, which I will show you guys later, which is showing that project structure that I just talked about with those tiers, just to flip through real quick, just so it gives maybe some people a chance to look at something kind of fun. Any questions? Does this make sense? Okay, cool. All right, so here are the tiers, and I threw a couple of nominees up, and I've got 10, and I'd like some more nominees. First of all, when I checked the CJEC site, originally when I was going to do this talk, I thought I would spend a little bit more time just focusing on the specific one that I was going to recommend. But then when I looked at the CJEC site, and I said, oh wait, the Yammer guys were out and talked about DropWizard just a couple months ago, right? We actually, Dynacron came in earlier this year and did a presentation on NoSQL packages, including Mongo. This stuff here starts to get a little bit outside of the realm of what, for a CJEC group, it's more of a JavaScript user group kind of stuff, but I thought I'd throw it up here. So first question, are there any of these that people aren't familiar with that they would like a quick 30-second description of what they are?
Can I ask,
Sure.
can we add another category in here?
Absolutely.
I mean, for instance, we had to recently make the decision whether or not we wanted to use Apache Commons versus Google Guava for our utility
Sure.
stuff. So I don't know if that really fits any of these categories. It certainly doesn't. It seems like another category.
Yeah, that's a tough one because it's a utility library.
Right, we could use either, but it's,
Yeah,
it's a
Well,
matter
that's
of,
easy to use Guava, no way.
Yeah, the insurance is Guava, but no.
matter of standardizing or something like that within the development team.
I think standard utility package like that is good. So, we'll add that utility.
You can use
You know, it's funny because does that. I struggled also about putting the DI one up here too, right? Because some of these frameworks have their own model that they bring to the table. So is it half of one, half of the other? I just sort of said, okay, we'll just put them up as a nominee.
Hey, can you give us the 30-second on DropWizard?
On DropWizard?
Yeah.
Okay, sure. So, well, that's actually the one I've got the project on my
Okay.
my laptop that I can walk through. So, actually, how about we wait on
Sure.
DropWizard because I've
Table.
got the sample on there, and I just open it up. In, I guess, the 10-second, 15-second is DropWizard is a set of libraries for building REST services, in particular JSON services. So it works on a model where the idea is that you just start out with a little Maven project, you add a couple of things to it, and then now you have a nice REST service up and rolling. So, and what you wind up with is a jar that you can deploy, which is more consistent with a really simple deployment model. So you don't even get VARs that you then deploy into a container. It's just this one nice tight little package. And now also support for serving static assets too. So if you want to build Angular and Ember, the top to Mongo with DropWizard, it's all built in, and that's got some really nice services for things like, let's say I want to talk to an RDBMS and Mongo, incoming request comes in and I want to have it async, talk to both of those, then tie it back together and then kick it off to the JSON view. It's pretty slick on the package. Juice. That's how I pronounce it. Juice. So both of the, so Spring, are you familiar with dependency injection with Spring? Juice is basically a really stripped down, lightweight, tight dependency injection framework. Only has annotation support in it, so no XML. It's just a really clean, simple thing. It's made by the Google, and the kind folks at Google.
Oh.
That, well, they're all kind. So that's the 2-second version on it. Anybody else?
Juice is great though, just occasionally they'll inject some ads into your dependencies.
But it's targeted, right?
Throwing catchy comments.
So let's see, Java,
It also cracks.
comments.
That's a feature of the development.
I mean, I think Jersey's more like a web services framework, but.
Well, if you're talking about,
Yeah, core. Yeah, fair enough.
I'm just saying, if you're talking about server side,
You are
doing JSON.
You are correct, sir. Core. DropWizard. NBC. Jersey. Any other nominees?
Rest easy,
Which one?
rest easy.
I've never heard of it.
Stapos. Stapos is restful implementation.
Okay. Cool. That's part of why I think this is fun.
I could throw out Restlet, but I'm not willing to defend it in any way.
Okay. Anybody else? I would almost say if you're not willing to defend it, then, because anybody else here heard of Restlet? Yeah, okay, okay. Anybody else? One, two other? Okay. Anything else, core?
I don't know if Grails is necessarily core. I mean, it's like a full stack framework, kind of like Play.
This is where I put Grails, yeah.
Okay.
Grails.
Again, I won't defend it, but.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing that's interesting is like, you know, well, would you defend Grails? Like if you were going to pick these, would you? No. Okay. Right. You know, I know it's not Java, it's JavaScript, but Node is another one that would kind of go here. That's one that even though I know we've done perf and load on it for customers, and we found it to fall over. The threading and all this stuff is not where it should be yet. So it's not Java, so we put on there anyways, but we wouldn't put there because of that real world experience. All right, anybody else? Last going once, 3, 2, 1 on that one. Yeah, framework. Spring. Juice. I'm gonna put none. And none/roll. And then I'm also going to, and then for all these we'll also do not sure.
I think every project should roll their own everything.
Yeah. Well, the only reason I'm going to roll around on this one this is awesome. We're getting started. We're getting rolling now.
When do you get things done?
I think that I could make a credible case for roll your own for your DI stuff. I could make the case for it. Utility stuff, this core stuff, no way. Like I think you'd be that would be too hard personally. Persistence tools.
Elasticsearch.
Elasticsearch. Okay, well that's more. Is that more? Would you put that like in search with like we've seen in Solo and stuff more?
You could, but you can also use it as a NoSQL database. I mean, you can store and retrieve JSON. So.
Okay. How about this? How about instead of trying to enumerate all the packages, like when we did the presentation on NoSQL packages, there were about 30 packages that I'd identified with different types. So how about for the interest of simplicity, we go with SQL and NoSQL and leave it at that? Okay.
How about on the SQL, paid versus free?
Does that apply to all
Sure.
of these though?
So open source.
Well,
Some of them are free.
Whether you want to pay Larry or you want to go different.
Okay, open source, RWS, NoSQL and commercial.
You might write NoSQL into document-oriented or key value store, but they would apply.
I'm gonna go with those that's usage dependent.
Isn't that the whole point of such a thing?
No, well, yes and no. I mean,
Okay.
like, and this is a great conversation to have, right? Like, you know, is document more appropriate or key value, for example? I would say that would depend on a level of detail that we don't have in our project charter, basically, right? But I don't consider them things that you can swap in and out.
Right.
I think it's more. This is more like I think what we're shooting for on this one right now is just philosophically where would you be, what would be your first tool in your toolbox? So maybe, all right. Yeah, now I'm talking myself around it. Key value, doc store, any other broad classifications of NoSQL that you want to throw out there? No, okay. What we got?
Okay, so it's the object database type, NoSQL.
Graph.
Wasn't there
How about-
another
how
CTO
about-
talk recently?
Yeah, it was, well, we were talking about Neo4j specifically, which is a graph database package. So yeah, we'll put graph. The only package that I know of right now that's graph, that's getting usage is Neo, but I think there's hypothetically other ones out there. Okay, front end, Bootstrap, Angular, and Ember. What? GWT? Okay.
Swing.
What was that?
Swing.
Swing.
Yay.
Why not in Atlas?
What's swing? Is that?
Oh, come on.
Until I work
You have to remember that
When they're not making
CJAG meeting.
What, are you saying NBC? Is it video?
This is just traditional MVC, just as a vote, like, if you don't feel that you're comfortable with those yet, or whatever.
Maybe instead of like swing, just like rich clients, there's a whole bunch of
that includes what?
Eclipse.
Yeah.
Including that ecosystem.
Straight JavaScript?
So.
Roll your own, right?
Well,
Roll your
yeah.
own.
Well, rolling around with some help, a lot of help. Yeah, sort of, just along those lines. It could be jQuery, or it could be just sort of selecting libraries per library. jQuery is sort of almost default,
Okay.
but that strategy.
Anything else? Okay. Build dependencies. I put 3 up there. Build.
I would actually suggest that they should be separate.
How's that?
Well, some of us think that dependency management, automated dependency management is evil, but we definitely want to have an automatic build system.
So like Ant, but then you don't want to use ID for dependency management?
Absolutely.
So by the way, you left Bootstrap in the front end.
Ant grunts. Ant. Creable. Okay. I'm just gonna leave that there because I think the DI are. What was that?
You left Bootstrap out, right?
Bootstrap. Bootstrap.
Which is on the short list there. Bootstrap on the front end.
Well, Bootstrap's really a responsive design template, not a framework on this one. I put it up there, but I don't know. I'm a little worried that we're getting into so much stuff we're not gonna have time to get through it. So I'm just gonna leave that one off.
Are we diving into DevOps stuff like Jenkins and Sonar, or what are we doing here? No?
I don't think we have time.
Not going there?
No. We're already good. We can, how about your CI tool? Let's throw up that Jenkins or Team City. Anything else anybody's using? That? None? In which case we should tell it. CI, Jenkins, Team City.
Bamboo,
And oh, but I wouldn't recognize. Well, and IDE.
What's the one GitHub uses?
I think Mike CI and Travis are both a couple open source ones. Yeah, I don't know anybody who's using them for professional work stuff at this point because they're all CI in the cloud. It's still a little.
Do we care about source code repositories? Do we really want to
We
go
all
there?
care, but again, time. And yeah, which is another one that's like, the short one is, I will report this data point. Every single client that we talk to nowadays is evaluating and or in the process of already switching over again. Every single client. Including the .NET shops. A lot of them are, looking at the CFS stuff, but a lot of those guys are actually looking at getting them as well.
How much of that is sort of playing with the toolkit? Because if they're evaluating,
There's a Visual Studio plugin for Git now. I don't know. Just-
I'll just say as a longtime SVN user, the ability to have an unlimited number of shelves is just too cool, even for the pain.
I feel like, yeah, like the hardest part is getting the checkouts and the keys and stuff like that sorted out, but once you're using it, you can use it and you get it. So that's just where it's going. Okay, all right, so we got a ton of stuff, yes.
Under build and dependencies, I guess if you list play, you're going to be using SBT.
You got it, SPT. All right, is that enough? There's more than enough stuff to go through and vote on.
Couldn't you make the argument that your development environment should be IDE agnostic?
Yes.
So, like, you don't really need to choose.
Correct. So for our projects, we typically do that. Another set of things like code quality enhancements and stuff, we rely on stuff like checkstyle and TMD and find bugs for enforcing that. We tend not to put, like styles and prohibit people from using multiple IDEs. So for all the stuff we do, our build project, which is usually Maven, is the standard. That's the gold standard, and then you have your IDE support. That's but people still like to argue over it. So.
Just put it down in case we finish too early.
I expect to walk out of here with net beans and yes.
So I don't want to digress too much into that, but I'm curious about the overhead that incurs on a team. Say you've got a team of 5 developers, maybe that's an average sized team, and you've got 3 different IDEs that you're supporting. How do you document that for somebody onboarding and who's responsible for making sure it works in every one of those IDEs?
The short answer is we don't. What we do is we usually have a reference IDE for each project. So that's where, because there's usually, whoa,
So you pick one and you basically pick one and you say this is the main one.
This is our,
and if you know what the heck you're doing, you want to use another one, then you're on your own with that, right?
Yeah. And my experience has been that people on projects tend to sort of 2 buckets pretty quickly. There's the people where their environments have problems and they're having to rebuild their IDEs all the time. They stick with whatever the standard is. So that for the company and the group and all that. Then the developers that are comfortable working with other tools, they can use whatever they want to use. And then remember that the CI server is reference in bold. So if it works on my environment in IntelliJ, but it doesn't work on the CI environment, that's an issue.
And a great way to onboard people is to pair. Just hook them up with somebody who already knows what they're doing, have them work through something, just get to speed pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, as a side note for that, what we're doing now is we'll set up projects where everybody on the team gets their own Git branch, and the CI server is doing the merge for you, and that blocks. So we basically are out of the business of broken builds, just as a side note. Okay. Let's roll through this really quick. Okay, so here's how it's going to work. This pass through, I'm going to use black to track the votes, and I'm just going to do a quick hand count. So, if out of all these packages, for the scenario that we described, this is the package, the one that you would want to use, raise your hand. DropWizard. 1,
Maybe.
2, you two. Okay. Spring MVC. 1, 2. Okay.
We can double vote, right?
Actually, I think
No?
for this one, let's
Okay.
not double.
All right, that's fine.
Okay, so Spring MVC. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Jersey.
That's
Rest
no
easy.
surprise.
Wrestlet.
Sounds cool.
Grails. Oh, how Grails has fallen. And not sure. Totally cool. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 vouchers. Interesting. So for purposes of this, since nobody voted for these, even though they were excellent nominees, we're just going to get struck from the conversation. Build. Maven. Okay, raise your hand. Grown and raised. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. 14 for Maven. Grunt. I listed up there, that's actually a JavaScript build tool, so I'm just going to strike it unless anybody complains. However, I wanted to put that up there as an FYI for any of you who are sitting around going, hey, I've got to deal with latest JavaScript, how am I going to deal with the build management and stuff? That's the tool that you're going to want to look at. Ant. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay.
I have a question on that regarding IDEs. Is there anything other than Maven that is sort of portable, like Ant? You got a random Ant build, it IDE has no idea what the hell to do with it, right?
No, some of the IDEs
They can
actually
generate Ant builds.
Some of them generate ant
Right.
builds, but some of the IDEs have the ability to map ant tasks to, or ant targets to their lifecycle commands. That's kind of like, you're gonna spend more time fighting with that at
Right.
that point.
Not like Maven. I mean, that's the only reason I like Maven is that feature, but the rest is.
Yep. Gradle. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 votes for Gradle and SBT.
Can I do a negative vote?
No other votes, it's off the list. Okay, dependency injection. Spring. 1, 2, 3. Oh wait, I'm sorry. 1, 2. Okay, up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 15. Juice. 1, 2. None. Roll your own. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Is it none or roll your own?
It's either, yeah. Because what usually winds up happening is you like
Try to roll your own and get none.
Whatever. Oh, we didn't do the not sure on build tool. Not sure on build tool? Everybody has an opinion. Dependency injection, not sure? Everybody has an opinion. Interesting. Front end. Let's do good old MVC traditional, where struts two-shot and we like it. Anybody? Okay. Any votes? Nobody. Wow.
Which is a little weird given the spring ABCs.
Yeah, I mean,
But they might be using Spring MVC to pump in JSON.
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, or they-
And that's actually a lot of the work that we're doing right now. We're making these out of Spring MVC apps. And that's seriously, we just go ahead. And the back end guys are like, yay, I don't have to care about this stupid HTML JavaScript stuff anymore. And then the front end guys are like, yay, I can make changes to my app without having to go rebuild the whole damn Java app. Ember? JS. Anybody who prefer to use that? Angular. 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Can you explain what those, why would we pick those? I don't even know, I've never heard of them.
You never heard of them? Okay, well then your vote would be probably for not sure. Right? So both Ember and Angular, the
+1 for Angular. Sorry.
+1 for Angular? Okay. Both of those are full rich JavaScript frameworks. And one way to think of them is that they're basically a full-blown MVC implementation for JavaScript, building an application. So think about, so historically, right, what somebody figured out was that you could actually load a whole bunch of JavaScript files and have JavaScript load the files next to its existing file and then swap in and replace chunks of content on the page. It's actually kind of cool because all of a sudden now you have this way of laying out your JavaScript applications almost like you lay out a Java application where you've got controllers that are injecting stuff into templates, which then represented views, and now you can build this nice structured application. And then what people did is they started adding in fancier features like two-way data binding between these things, and then also the ability to have observables, so you have your JSON interface roll it in or provide data sets that can then go into views. So you can go really fancy, rich, live applications, and these frameworks both give you complete models for how to work with it. So there are excellent intro webcasts on both of these up on YouTube. So that's how I caught up on some of this stuff was fire up YouTube on the Apple TV and watch it in HD, and you can actually see the code and the IDE, and it walks through how the controllers work and the data. These frameworks both also provide some support for testability. So, the eternal question of how do I test my JavaScript? This lets you decompose your app and do things like inject data and have views be testable and stuff. So one way things, these are real full-blown frameworks. Real complicated, full-blown.
Bug-free.
Absolutely.
So you can make your JavaScript code almost as bloated as your Java code.
Ember went 1.0 like 2 or 3 months ago, man.
You've set your bar too low.
Yeah, Angular is better supported, I think, personally, but this is actually, of all the votes here, this is one of the ones that I'm most interested in. because like you go up and there are so many articles comparing these things, and they always come down to these elaborate scoring systems, and then at the end it's like they're 1 point different. So very curious. Rich client votes.
What's your definition?
But what's my definition of a rich client? Anything that relies on the native windowing toolkit for the OS. So that can include Swing, AWT,
SWT.
Unity, 3D clients. I'm sure you guys are older than that. SWT.
Java
We're
FX.
building off of RCP. QT. Anybody recommend that? No? Good. And I know you guys all know what that is. GWT. 1, 2. jQuery, roll it around. 1, 2, 3, 4. There's a certain, like, yes, my name is nice to meet you. 5. Okay. It's tough because honestly, and there's a path to learning these. I'm going to walk through that. Not sure. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Dang. Okay. Utility, Guava. If you don't know, we're just going to skip these. Guava. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Jakarta Commons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What, 6? Okay. Okay, now you guys. One of my books was on Jakarta Commons, man. And none of you bought it.
You didn't put your hand up though.
Not sure.
Well, where's your hand?
Where's my not sure, don't care.
It's just
1, 2, 3, 4. So believe it or not, this one actually, I see people getting like really heated about it.
I see people getting heated about how many white spaces you put in their files too. It doesn't mean it's important.
Fair enough. Absolutely. Absolutely. Persistence. Open source RDBMS. MySQL, Postgres are the leading candidates in that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 16, 17, 18. It's the most popular thing in the whole thing. Key value, no SQL packages. 1?
Can I put negative?
No, we're gonna be cool, man. Commercial RDBMSs. Oracle, Sybase, DB2. SQL Server. Big fat 0 for the commercial. Doc Store, like Mongo. 1, 2.
Only one, you only vote for one.
Only vote for 1. And no SQL Graph, for J. Nope.
How about another category?
Another category.
Yeah, cloud or regular old servers in your database farm, whatever. I mean, instead of having
Deployment.
is the cloud or non-cloud?
Cloud or non-cloud? I think we have enough topics for CI.
You left out the not sure.
Oh, not sure, right. Okay, not sure.
It depends on the app.
Depends on, yeah. That was kind of where I was going with it earlier. Okay. CI. Jenkins? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Is that vote? Sure. Scratch. Okay, 9, 10. Team City. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Bamboo? No. And don't know, not sure, don't care.
I have another option is a new startup in Seattle called Shippable. Has anyone used them? They have kind of like a hosted continuous integration thing that's supposed to be much better than Jenkins.
In the cloud.
Yeah.
Nope. Alright. Anybody, okay, maybe not sure, don't care. 1, 2, 3, 4.
I haven't used them either, so.
Okay, cool. Alright, so. Huh? And, IDE. Okay, this is what your preference would be. It's all yours. Not what you're gonna, all the teams shall use this IDE, but no, what you just would use personal preference. Your
Notepad.
Huh?
Notepad+.
Notepad. Notepad.
BI.
Emacs.
BI.
BI. What's Nano? Edmund. The matcha choice. The matcha choice. Okay, clips.
Sublime.
Yes.
Sublime.
Ultra.
I'm gonna put that under matcha for Java. Clip, this is your Java ID. Okay. Your Java ID, not your front end framework stuff. Clips. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. IntelliJ.
George.
I think Eclipse goes under Macho.
So that's trash talking. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And scratch your boat. Scratch. 7. For IntelliJ. Okay, NetBeans. Come on, man.
I like
One guy?
NetBeans too.
Awesome.
You never use it.
I have a soft spot there. All right, any of the macho options. Not these full-blown stuff. It could be Sublime, it could be Coda, it could be Text Wrangler, BB Edit, Emacs VI. Hands up for the machos. 1, 2, 3. Okay, 3. Cool. So my hope is that this vote alone will be helpful for you guys.
So we need to pick hardware too, right?
No.
Where's this gonna run?
You know there's an IDE that you can get that runs on your Android phone, man. My hope would be that this right here would be helpful for you guys. Like you could walk out of this meeting today right now with this information and have a sense of where people are at in their heads in the market and all that. Okay. All right, so take a few minutes to walk you guys through considerations. So these are the things that I think about when I'm asked to make this happen and figure out what to get, where to go with that. First one, team scaling. These are not in order, by the way. These are just ones that I listed. But team scaling. How does it work for one person? It's not the same how does it work for teams. Developer productivity, which is kind of related to that. So let me give you an example. How many files do I have to touch just to add a feature? Okay. It's a simple, let's say I want to just add what will eventually manifest to the user as one field, and I need to have that in the RWS, the middle tier, front end, all that. How much work is it to get that?
Just edit one 10 megabyte XML file and you're done.
Exactly. And that's actually one of the things that you look at is like, is there a magic file? And I'll talk about that under SCM, but it's also applicable here. So for example, context.xml, right? It's a pain in the arse to have to manage it and have a whole bunch of people editing it at the same time. So you want to think that through.
So you have to counter the small number of files with separation
Right.
aspects. I mean, yes, there's lots of files if you're doing it right because you have these things that are really isolated.
Right, and that's where this is a really tough one to walk through because there are certain kinds of things that are appropriate, right? It's you know, I'm adding a new field, I need to add this property, and that's part of what my process is. There are other times when it's just cruft, right? Like Grails, for example, one of its fancy features is that it basically is a code generator. Is that good? That it's a code generator and it's really spraying all these files out? Old EJBs, like EJB 1 and 2, kind of notorious for having to maintain all this junk just to be productive, right? So it's not like I'm just saying one file or whatever is part of this. It just means that you're thinking through this stuff in your head when you're going through the conversation. That's what it's about. Testability. How hard is it going to be to test? So if we look at all these tools and frameworks over here, most of these actually aren't bad. I would point to the jQuery roll your own as being a nightmare to test. I think the rest of that stuff's actually reasonable. But yeah, if I had to go through the GUI, that's bad. Static code analysis support. So for can I automate some of the process that I'm using for my code reviews? Right? Release management. How does all this stuff support deploying the application? So some of these, like DropWizard, is built from the ground up with deployment as a major concern. So it thinks right out of the gate, when you go through just even the Hello World project, it's talking about how this thing's going to be deployed out of the box. Some of these others, Spring MVC, it's more like, oh, left is an exercise for the reader for how to deploy this thing. That's where some of the SQL packages are interesting, right? Because a lot of them, the developer API is actually pretty simple, but the deployment is really hard and very messy. Clustering, how you scale that. Additional considerations, tool support, autocomplete and refactoring. So that is an example of one of the reasons why we wound up rejecting Node as a package for doing middle tier. We found that the refactoring support and the autocomplete support just wasn't there. Cool stuff. SCM friendly. Some of these packages are better than others for dealing with source code management. Monitoring. So that is especially important with stuff like these persistence packages here, this core stuff here. Again, that's one of the areas where I found that DropWizard really shines because the monitoring stuff is built in right out the gate. Their hello world includes a hello world monitoring. Okay. Next, maturity. So this is an interesting one. This is a tough one. So I get asked this all the time. How mature is that framework? So how do you answer that question? Right? So there's opinion, and then there's I search for data. So here are a couple of the things that I look at. Indeed.com, if you guys haven't seen it, I'm going to flip it for you real quick. You guys haven't seen Indeed.com. So what is Indeed.com? It's a job search aggregation. So what it does is it takes, it's like the Google of search for jobs. It takes jobs from Craigslist, Dice, Monster, and a million other boards that you've never heard of and slurps them onto their master database. So this is where you go if you don't like your current job. However, for our purposes of assessing architectural stuff, this is what we're interested in. We can compare trends. So let's take a couple of our packages here. So I'm going to pick one. Let's see, what was a really controversial? What were any controversial ones here? People seem to have their opinions.
Do Angular number.
Angular number. There you go.
I'm sure.
This is actually where the naming of it is really annoying. Okay. So by popping those two in, I can see trend lines to see which ones are showing up for job trends. Right? So if I'm doing a presentation on these different packages and which ones are getting adoption, I'll actually go and just crib these graphics right off and put them in.
Right, so put jQuery in that list as well, and we'll see how small those are.
Oh, yes. Boom. Yeah. Well, interesting.
Right around the time it's ready to
this,
Yeah.
right? And this is where like this stuff gets fun because then you start playing the what, and why game. Okay. So any, since I've got it up here, anything else that we should check? Let's do Gradle and Maven.
Yeah.
Or is it Gradle, Ant, and Maven?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I will throw out that every so often, look at that. Yeah.
Everything seemed to have gone down in December.
They're just rolling around.
Last year.
But isn't it like stupid data to say that my job depends on Maven? And like that's.
No. What happens is
It's
these
like
are
it's
things
how many times it was mentioned in the job.
in a job posting.
Right, but I mean like those jobs are stupid.
Okay.
It's like saying like you have to eat with a fork and knife.
I don't know.
It's like you hire someone who doesn't know
Yeah,
data.
to
You
this
have to
point,
explain
It takes you
someone
like 3
used to
days to
pull
learn
up-
it.
Someone used to pull up struts graphs in here, and everybody would say, "Who's using struts?" And everybody would hold up their hands, and then I'd wait 3 seconds and say, "Who hates struts?" And everybody would keep their hand up.
So I have a more scientific sampling technique. So I usually search for Maven sucks and let's say Ant sucks.
You go to Google and Maven.
I think someone even, I don't remember, but someone built a site to streamline that process.
Maven does not suck, but the docs do. Maven doesn't suck, your palm does. Do you guys remember the Bile blog? Does anybody here remember the Bile blog? Yeah. There was this site where this guy would just like use the most foul language ever to describe all the different frameworks and tools. Okay. Let's go back. Okay. Other places to check? Stack Overflow? Yeah.
Well, maturity also has to do with community size. Is there an active community? Is there a mailing list? Is there, is development moving along? A lot of people could be using it, but there's nothing happening to the API.
Yeah, I put GitHub up there to sort of as a nod to that and to see what the activity's like on GitHub. SourceForge used to have some of that stuff that was really good. A lot of people have been moving off that. Google Code has stuff.
How do you measure Stack Overflow activity?
Oh, you can go in and see how many things are tagged with the topic.
Just the tag?
Yeah. So
You can see the followers on tag.
yeah, and that's another one of those ones that's a little tough because it's like if the framework's a total nightmare, then it's got a ton of questions. So is it like open and close rates, whatever.
You can look at the contributors list too, so you can see who answers questions. If it's a lot of people, then it's probably a good thing.
Yeah, I think Jason, you threw out an email recently about, you know, if you were looking at one of the frameworks and then you're like, we're in the middle of a refactor and it's not going well, and so you can sometimes find out.
Yeah, from my outside observer standpoint, it didn't look like it was going very well.
Yeah. And then Google Trends is also another site that you can go to search for and see how much activity there is in the blogosphere and the rest of the
There's kind of the quality of the community too, which can vary over the life cycle of a project. Especially like, so if you're a big company with lots of resources, having a really, really mature project is an advantage because you can go and pay people to fix stuff for you. But if you don't have any money to spend, you may actually be better off with a project that's not completely proven, that's like just around closing in of 1.0. Like I saw that with Angular, for example, like just before 1.0 you could post any of your problems in the mailing list and you get lots of answers and go fix stuff. Now that it's like 1.0, it's...
Right, is it done yet? Yeah, and there's some of that with that as a consultant, right? You have that challenge all the time because it's when do you invest in learning something, right? And how much do you invest? Because nothing sucks more than spending a bunch of time on a framework that died. I have a personal list of frameworks that I thought were cool that have now joined the graveyards over time.
What are they? What are those?
The ones that I
that
liked.
you thought were good. We're gonna go.
Well, I have a couple that I would sort of characterize as pets, where I was like, yeah, they're doomed. You know, it's like they're toast from the beginning. There was this one called Echo that I really liked. It was a JavaScript framework that gave you basically a component thing. It's very much like GWT in terms of its philosophical model, but I thought it was a lot simpler and cleaner to use. And
Except that it was all server side.
Except it was all server side because that was how it was generating it. They've actually redone it, but part of what I think really killed Echo 3 is that the whole thing was run by like one dude. And so at the end of the day, it just didn't get the resources in the community. He didn't want to grant others committer access and blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's tricky. And then I have other ones where I've gone through a whole path of how I felt about it. So back in 2002 and 2003, I started working with this early package for integrating with the database, which I thought was really cool. And then I even wrote a book on it in 2004, which of course was Hibernate. And then Hibernate got turned into a standard. It basically was the JPA portion of BJV3, and that was it. And then I did a presentation about 2 years ago, a year ago, for CJUG, where I basically said, yeah, just put it down. I made this.
How come we didn't use that, have that category in this list here?
Oh,
OR
or
mappers.
It kind of depends on
Mappers.
Time. Yeah,
Doesn't apply to this
doesn't apply in NoSQL. DropWizard has a MyDatas-like thing built into it, integrated with it. Spring MVC, you can pick which one you want, so I guess it would be a choice there. Same with Jersey. I don't know. Or it was just, I guess, the list of what's on people's mind. Do you guys want to do a quick? No, let's just keep moving. We don't have time. we have about 20 minutes left. It's 8 o'clock now.
Half an hour maybe.
Okay. All right. Developer aesthetics. This is a really tough one. This is one of the ones that I find the hardest to put any kind of number around. I'll give you an example. So Nimrod was talking about Objective-C this morning, just a little bit ago. And he's like, hey, it's kind of like Java, but except for the syntax, right? So, I mean, I tech reviewed a book on Objective-C, and it was like, by the end of the book, I felt like I could understand it, and I knew what was going on, but still, all those damn squared braces, seriously? You know, with the Lambda stuff coming up in 8, collections, and when it came out, you know, the syntax, I mean, even then you still get a little bit of a hairball of some of the syntax for that stuff.
Xcode sucks.
Xcode sucks. There you go. That's an IDE thing, but like, the tooling and the framework stuff, they all definitely come with a sense of style, and does that fit with your team, what you want to do, does it matter? Right? That's another whole conversation, but I don't have a good metrics way of describing that particular project. Of course, is it commercial or open source, costs, what have you, and tools, dev platform. So we talk to a lot of people who build stuff on top of ERP packages, right? And what they are is they're kind of these like weird sort of development platforms, but not really kind of things. And that's part of why, as a dev, you find that working in an environment like that to be very confining and just and hard to deal with and have your head around. Obviously, if it's not testable, that's even worse. But like most of those packages there are much more embedded. You can imagine ones that aren't. Performance testing. So there's a couple whole presentation you can do just on performance, of course. I think we have done that procedure a couple times. Gatling, UStar, those are some good tools for example, this stuff here. If you want to proof out some of your persistence package, you can use things like Gatling to drive some load on it and start collecting some numbers.
I think you misspelled UStar. It's written with a $sign.
Yes, well, it is a commercial tool. It's a commercial tool, but if you don't know what NewStar is, you go up, you sign up, and basically you can pop in a Selenium script, and it'll throw up to 1 million threads worth of load onto your app. So we've used it compared to setting up your own environment with able to generate that level of load. It's actually really cheap. If you're working on your own personal project, it's probably more expensive than you want to use.
Yeah, they don't have like any good like entry level plans.
Not really.
So should there be like a TM next to
Is
that on your slide?
Is that
Should there be a TM on your slide?
on the NewStar? Yes, probably. It's
Maybe
just
from-
a tool. It's just another thing in the list. But part of it gets into when you're doing the evals, how much load do you want to throw at it? If you are working for a large retail company and you're looking at a package and you know that you've got to support a huge number of users, Gatling may not be sufficient for you to get. A NewStar, you can literally, once you get the approval for the 4 or 5 figure check, you can actually start running test that after you get with it. So. And then JavaScript frameworks. So JavaScript frameworks, Angular and Ember in particular, there's a ton of turf battles over which one's more performant and for what scenarios. Some of like Angular has this magic scope object in it. So JavaScript stuff, too early to call. Have to pick something for your next project. This is the learning path I would recommend for folks. If you haven't done this, you start with, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. jQuery, Backbone, Angular, and Ember. So you can start, get some books, work through it, walk through it. These are some links. Slides will be up on the CJUG site. You can go through it later. We are running short on time. This is how people, this is an example for Angular. It's cool, it sucks, it's cool, it sucks, it's cool, it sucks. That's what the running process is like.
What is that? You want to consider like what abundant environment you're going to be, if you want to go into all Amazon, or where you're going to actually put it eventually.
Oh, like
what,
if it's-
what do they like? What do they?
Yeah, we can do a vote like in terms of clouds
I
or
think somebody,
non-cloud.
yeah, somebody mentioned that earlier.
I did.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That seems
cloud
curious.
on-prem.
That's a good one because that's sort of
Yeah.
almost where you have to start because the clouds offer such different things.
Yeah.
So-
in brief, my art, when we talk to clients, cloud or on-prem is almost always driven by a business conversation that you're having that sort of drives some of that. Almost everything up here can be run in both places. So it's going to depend on the context for what you're doing. If it was like your startup that you're doing in your basement, you probably would be setting up and running a bunch of stuff on different cloud packages. There's a ton of them that support that stuff, like CloudBees. Actually, that's a cool tip. Almost everything that's up here for tools and frameworks, if you go up to cloudbees.com, they are a hosted CI environment, and you can click one button and get up and running with a Git repository, initialized with one of this, Jenkins jobs hooked up to it, and a deployed app up running in the cloud, all with like one click. So, and they do have an entry-level package you can get going for like $10 a month.
No longer.
Huh?
I think they scrapped that and they have like the cheapest one is like $50 now.
Yeah.
Unless you were lucky enough to get one while they were still cheap.
Yeah, so I have a grandfather one, I guess. But then, Heroku or Mike and Travis and on and on. So, I have created a set project on the Dynacron Group GitHub, and this is, somebody's asking, so what's your pay? This is basically where my head's at right now. DropWizard with TestNG. Yes, 10G. So, and I spent a lot of time sort of going, well, really is TestNG all that much cooler than JN? Yeah, actually, it's a lot cooler than JN. It was pretty easy to migrate. I was able to take a whole test suite with a bunch of tests and move it over.
Have you looked at Logback? Is that worth?
Logback?
Oh yeah, logging frameworks, another cat.
So this project already has SLF and Logback already pre-configured. And then and some of the pieces in there,
Sorry.
some of the pieces in there like are really noisy, and so the Logback config that I checked in kind of the noise back a little bit. So anyway, here's the thing. I've got a bunch of this stuff up in there. It's not done yet, and this is a bit of an experiment for me too to see like, okay, well, take a look at. If you guys think that you want to add something, contribute, that'd be awesome.
One thing that we haven't really talked about, I'm not sure if we should or not, is security considerations, like authentication kind of stuff. And how are you going to protect it from exploits and that kind of thing? Is that something that's a separate consideration, or do you consider that just part of the frameworks you're using?
So my take on identity is probably one of the most important components of every single project that we touch, period. And if you're doing something that, I don't know why, but we talk about SOA architectures a lot when we go to clients, and I still get this little twinge every time we talk about it. But if you're doing all these JSON REST services, for example, the identity component touches everything. So you have to get it sorted out. Most of these, DropWizard, why didn't put play up here? DropWizard, play, Spring MVC has Spring Security, and then there's also Apache Shiro, which is a really nice package as well. You plug in one of those and then you go with it, and you have a different model. So like if I'm doing DropWizard and it's a small scale project, I'm just integrating it directly into the app. But if I'm doing something more at scale, then I have to basically set my own identity service and go from there. And there's also a ton of commercial packages, some of which I probably wouldn't recommend, but so yes, it's huge. Yeah, we could put it on the list. You know, time constraints is all really, but we can follow up like maybe on CJ really wants to see what people go for. Any other questions, concepts, thoughts? Cool. All right, I'd love to see some of you guys. I see you at CJ, but it'd love to be cool to like you guys check it out. How it's out, whatever. Pretty fun.
Maybe just check it out and reformat the source code.
Yeah, and then commit it. Like, probably not going to get committer access to. All right. So people are asking me about what I recommend. Last one, AngularJS. If everybody would ask why for that project Bootstrap template that I just did, why Angular? I must have spent hours reading through blogs, going through, downloading, working through the tutorials, trying to get Bootstrap on it. Finally, I said, I got to pick one. I'm going to go with Angular. A couple things. One is the data attribute, I think works nicer with tools. This is one that really struck me. So Google sponsors Angular, and Google says that this is the stuff that they're going to be building into their browser itself. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And the data binding stuff that it did seems cool, and the testability I love. You know, you pull down Angular and you're already talking about unit testing your JavaScript on. Okay. That's my blitz through it. We have about 20 minutes until we're supposed to wrap, which means that we can get a couple people, if anybody wants to make a big pitch for any of their pet favorite frameworks or tools here. George. You got one on here. I think you were a big favorite fan of Ants.
I voted for Ants, but I actually have my own tool out.
So you did your your own build too?
I did.
Okay.
From an open source project called Scala.
Okay. All right. Are you open sourcing it anytime soon?
It is open source already. Just the fact that it's there by secret to obscurity.
All right. Let's see. Anybody have anything else on here that?
I will.
Yes.
I'm sharing. I'm a huge fan of GDP because I think JavaScript doesn't humanly scale. Because they talk about 7,000 lines in a large JavaScript app. Google Gmail is 300,000 lines. They have something on the order of 400 dedicated JavaScript developers, but they have a huge draw to pull people in. Anyways, I was talking about this with one of my managers, and he sort of said something to me that was really stunned. And he says, well, yes, getting good JavaScript developers is hard, but it turns out getting Java developers who are willing to do UI is really hard. So if your whole platform is based on writing Java in the UI space, you might not actually be any better off than going out and trying to recruit a large number of JavaScript developers. So that's my pitch for using DHT.
That leads into my pitch for
Angular and
JavaScript.
Ember specifically are intended to address some of those large-scale concerns around JavaScript and large development.
Well, actually, my concerns are social. They're not. I mean, all the really good JavaScript people I know are not team players.
Interesting. Would you say the same is true for mobile app devs?
There is an aspect that and you're in high demand, you don't have to put up with team bullshit.
So we had about 12, 13,000 lines of JavaScript. And I will caveat that with, we also had code reviews that were actually religiously enforced, so that may have changed things. But if you're using jQuery or one of those other frameworks, it is much easier to make modular bits of JavaScript. And I would not try to write that many without a DOM tool, like for instance jQuery, and copious unit tests. Yeah, the first JavaScript thing I ever worked on was about 1,200 lines, and I swore I would never write JavaScript again. And then jQuery came along, and I had second thoughts.
Just the refactoring issue.
Yes.
Brian, just to add to Jason's point, I think since you started writing DWT stuff, the libraries that you could choose to simplify the code you have to write and roll your own code is significantly grown. So there's a lot less of code you have to write as a JavaScript developer anyway. So you're not really writing as big a JavaScript code base anymore.
A lot less tedious code, which
Yeah.
leaves you energy to write interesting
Right.
code instead of tedium.
I would actually
Yeah.
take that even a step further and say that the biggest challenge keeping on top of the JavaScript world is just dealing with the sheer profusion of libraries and tools that are coming out. The energy that's in that space right now is out of control, and there's so much stuff.
Yeah, I would advocate for the jQuery, just select the particular libraries you need for that particular job approach rather than sort of this fully prescriptive approach of Angular, because I think these fully prescriptive approaches, and especially Angular, just from what I know of it, are not quite on. Okay, so if you're going to go with a jQuery strategy or a general strategy, you have to be disciplined, etc. But I think you have more flexibility at that point. Whereas if you go down the Angular route, you got to go with their program, you got to go with their inline HTML style, which I particularly don't like. And to me, it seems like it seems like it's overly prescriptive at this time of JavaScript development, and there's so much in JavaScript that's, it's almost it's a lot of homework, but at the same time, there's a lot of tons of reward.
So he raises a good point. One of Lance Young used to say, things that are easy, things that are difficult should be easy, and things that are really difficult should still be doable. And
Well, he got that quote from somebody else.
right.
Yeah.
The point is that if you remember the old DB days, it's like, well, I got 95% of the way there in the first hour. But then over the next 10 years, I was not able to finish the project. So if you have, your system basically doesn't allow you to peek through the abstraction, then you sort of toast.
Yep. I'm going to give you an example of a counterpoint on your comment, because I thought it was very interesting. That whole concept of roll your own, you have this flexibility, and we're short on time.
No, actually, we do have more time, by the way.
Okay.
We can go till 9 if we need to.
Okay.
We normally schedule till 9.
Yeah, I want to keep people from beer. So.
So we can do the IE discussion.
Oh yeah. So here's what
I was just gonna make one point though.
Yeah.
I think one of the attributes that are important for a framework, IDE, technology platform, whatever, is how much they lock you in or require you to use the entire thing or nothing. It's like Spring, for example, is quite nice from that perspective. You can pick and choose what pieces of it you want to use or not. Whereas other MVC frameworks, you may not have a choice. You basically you get the good, bad, and the ugly.
Yeah. So I think DropWizard's pretty good on that. I would actually rate Play a little bit lower on that.
Yeah.
Play's really like, hey, this
is what you got. Yeah.
So I remember when we voted for Maven, a couple people ground. This is the Maven project for the Greenfield. Okay? Maven's very strict. It's very prescriptive. It says this is how your project's going to be laid out. This is how you're going to do it. So I'm going to walk you through this Greenfield. I've got all the information about its artifact and all that stuff. Here I've got the source control stuff. So by filling this stuff out, I'm able to do things like generate a report that shows me a change list for the last 30 days. And I can include that in the documentation automatically. Right? So these aren't just like random data bits. These are actual real functional pieces of this project file. Here I'm saying that you have to be on Maven 3.1. It's a UTF-8 project, of course. Jason Jackson. Here's the issue management tracker. So this is the thing that ties together. Now I can say, pull down the list of all the open issues. Include that with the documentation. The organization stuff gets stamped at the bottom. I put this little bit of license in, and now it goes up, sucks the Apache license down, and bundles it in with the project. Here I'm specifying that I want current versions of all these plugins. Here I'm saying I want JDK 1.7. Here I'm saying I want the nice format, and I want to use Markdown for documentation. I'm running parallel test execution. This is the Shade plugin, which is the thing that takes my app that I built and sticks it all together into one simple jar. And that's all I need to do to deploy. Stitching it together. Here's where it flags with my main classes to launch it. Stitch it together, and here's my dependencies. TestNG, Fast, DropWizard itself. Well, this is the DropWizard testing library. Typeset config, which I actually don't really need. Guava, Logback, Jackson for JSON parsing, MongoDB, Morphia, which is a Mongo Jackson integration, the DropWizard core, and here's some reports. So it goes through and it builds the reports. It tells me whether or not my dependencies are current or not. It generates a Java doc, source code cross-reference, the tag list, and the code source. So here's the thing about Maven. Okay, first of all, XML kind of sucks. Right? I'm just going to make that assertion.
That was my plug for Gradle, actually.
Yep.
Started looking at the XML.
I'm looking at the XML. One of the things that gets me about Maven is that if they just simply took a few minutes and converted some of these things that are, sub-child elements into attributes, that actually you could probably compress Maven files probably by a factor of about two-thirds, I think, like all those dependencies and stuff. But here's the thing. Everybody in here who's working on a Maven project, they know what this is. Every IDE can open this file up and work with it. You're doing IntelliJ, you're doing NetBeans, right? So, here's the thing. When you use a framework that's more prescriptive, it has the opinion, right? Then you can, it's easier to find people, and it's easier to have a team that comes together and says this is what the standards are for how to do our work. So the trick is every one of these technologies goes through this evolutionary process where they start out, it's like, it's young, it's hip, it's cool, it's fresh, right? I started doing Java in 1995. So I was working at Symantec at the time, we were doing C++ tooling. About 2 years later, these guys came in from this company. They handed me a couple of 3.5-inch floppies, and they were like, we wrote a server in Java. I was like, really? Yeah. Java's for dancing applets. You wrote a server in Java? And so these 4 or 5 floppies were basically it was a stuffed archive of, which was the very first rev of the WebLogic server. Which of course is hilarious because a couple years later, WebLogic is like 40 80s, right? But at the time, it was like this cool, hip, young thing, right? WebLogic was like this cool little startup thing. Nowadays, it's like WebLogic, it's this monster, right? So all of these things go through. So Spring, right? Spring, do you guys remember Better, Faster, Lighter Java? That's when they first started talking about Spring? Okay. I have a book on my desk called Spring Recipes, right? And it's for like 3.0 or 3.5, roughly. And that sucker is this thick, right? Yeah, because somebody brought it back in. So it was like, I was half tempted to raffle it off in a meeting or something. Who can I pay the most to take this thing on?
I bought it 2 weeks ago.
Right, so that's I bought that book 2 weeks ago. It's a $50 book, man. So let's take Angular, right? So Angular has been going for a while now, and it's getting to where, there's a book worth the stuff on it, right? Is that good? Is it not? I don't know. That's where I pointed to that learning curve on it.
So the argument for Gradle, I haven't used Gradle, but from what I've seen, it gives you, the dependency management that you want from Maven. You take advantage of the repositories that are there if you want, with the flexibility and freedom that you might want with Ant, without coding in XML, right?
Well, so that's actually part of the whole thing about Maven, right? Is that this is not intended to be code. The very first version of Maven, Maven 1.0, had this thing in it called Jelly.
Oh, yeah.
It was like, so Jelly was like an XML programming language, right? And the guy who created Jelly took it down. and he said he just replaced it with a public apology. Programming in XML is a terrible idea. So if your Maven files are getting to the point where you're feeling like you need like dynamic, things that are getting stitched together for some reason, I would start to make the case that maybe your build process is getting a little too complicated for it's maybe being a little too clever, trying to do too much. One, two, you can always bang out and use Ant or Gradle or whatever as an escape hatch for this stuff. With Gradle, what we've been looking at, we lose the IDE support that we want, and then we also basically now are trading in for a lot of runtime build config. It's almost like the difference between going from Java to Groovy, because it's Groovy. So even though this Maven stuff sucks to look at, I agree, the XML is not my favorite. It's still so much more stable for our builds and what we're trying to do. That's why we like it.
Way better than Ant.
Right.
Ant is just chaos.
And the dependency management stuff is actually kind of, I know somebody was, George, you were saying you don't like the dependency management stuff.
Correct.
By and large, in the industry right now, pretty much everybody has said, yeah, we want to do the dependency management with the Maven stuff. So all of the tooling, and with Ivy, Gradle, SBT, they all build on top of the Maven dependency management system. And we've been using it for years now, as long as don't ever put a snapshot up on your central Nexus or Artifactory. That's one of your big anti-patterns.
Yeah, I think the key is what he said is think of it, your POM as your documentation for your project. Because I think that's really, I mean, if you start thinking of it as your build, as a build thing, then that's just the wrong avenue. It's documentation, it's documenting your project.
Yeah, so here's the effective POM for this project. So this is the actual final resolved version of my build. And so then that gets stamped into my build so I can find out where the hell everything was and what came from. If I have to do a dynamic thing to figure that out or kind of retrofit that later, these effective POMs get stamped in with our releases so we know what happened and how it's built. So we
But it's still his argument about using a prescriptive thing. So for your build system, for your project management, sure, that's to use Maven is fine because that's not your product. It's your how you build your product. But if you're using some some restrictive framework to build the product, when you it happens all the time with open source stuff. If you bump up against, it's really easy to do the first, to basically get a prototype working and do some basic stuff, but then you try to do, the really cool, edgy stuff. And, well, the developers didn't think about that. The developers of the framework, so you hit a brick wall and you've got to start hacking the framework.
Maybe.
So that's,
we haven't, I mean, to be honest, I haven't had that issue that you're describing with open source frameworks very often. And in fact, like sort of as an example, I remember we needed something from HTTP client, and so I was actually able to work with the maintainer of it to get the patch in that we needed. We bought a support contract from a very popular open source company, and it was like firing tickets off into a black hole. So like what line where, what's easy or not, at least with open source stuff, I know that if I need to build like a one-off rev for dependency, I can do that.
I think a good example of that is Hibernate.
Yeah.
It's a kind of framework that makes it really convenient to get started, but then once you get started, you get particular about what kind of SQL is. You don't want to have like all your every single column updated every time you do something or whatever. Suddenly you find yourself you end up putting so many workarounds. It would have been easier to just use plain JSON.
Two more examples: Tapestry and Wit.
And what's the other one?
Wit.
GPT?
Yeah.
He's going to take that argument offline.
Yeah, I don't think Elcos, no Wicket. Everybody else, Tapestry, I heard that one.
So you're gonna show the app too?
Well, oh, sure, yeah. Well, I guess we got just a couple minutes. So the app, where it stands today, show us my screens.
How did you know what technologies we would choose?
Yeah, I'm not seeing. I don't see that. I don't think there was enough movement here, and I was interested that with a couple of brave souls like George, and nobody really was like, yeah, I'm gonna fight for whatever framework.
Well, DropWizard is pretty cool. I mean, I don't know how many people know about it or not. It's relatively new, but in my opinion, it's got some really cool features.
Yep. So did you guys? Didn't Yammer come out and present on it?
Yeah, that was I think last year or maybe earlier this year, end of last year, I think.
Okay. So all right. We'll back up. So this is the DropWizard project. So it's read material, created by Yammer, pulls together stable, mature libraries, simple work package. So configuration, metrics, logging, operation, production quality. Pretty straightforward stuff. Just getting started. So some of the components are listed over here, and then this is actually the hello world that you walk through to build it. So in a lot of ways, the project I have is building off of that as a core. So what I've got here is these 4 classes here. Basically, are the hello world Bootstrap stuff for DropWizard. So let's just look at them real quick. So this is the service, and you'll note there's actually a main here, right? So this is part of totally turning that whole concept of I'm deploying in the container on its head, right? You talk about you hit your walls with what you can do within the constraints of a Tomcat or a Jetty, for example, right? Which is funny because those were the light, fast ones even 2 years ago when we were building stuff. So DropWizard, you start with this simple main, you pass in some args. This then kicks off the DropWizard plumbing. So simply launching the service, which is then extending off of the standard service, even though they're even doing nice things here with some of the generics. Initializes and adds a bundle. So I've got 2 services here. I've got my green, and then I'm also adding some static assets. And then I run it. So here it's tucking in the config and the environment, adding the resource and the health check. So that's where some of the other stuff here kicks in. So this is the resource, which is simply the thing that's saying I'm a JSON view. Some of this is actually from the template, which isn't going to be used in the app itself. Here's the health check. So this health check stuff we use on all of our projects nowadays. And what it is basically a way to quickly have an HTTP request that tells you, did this thing work or not, right? And so if you're building a front end, and especially if let's say you're an enterprise company where you're building the front end and it talks to 16 different back-end services, right? And you're the guy with the pager. So that means you get a page in the middle of the night because the web app's down. Well, it turned out it was because the message queue was down, or because the RDMS was down, or Mongo, or whatever the hell it was. So by providing these service checks that do these sort of hello worlds to whatever the integration components are that you need, now you have a really easy way to put a monitoring, to either hook into their existing monitoring or add your own monitoring to quickly diagnose what the issue is. So then you train the support guys who are sitting there to always look at that page, and then they know who to page. I suppose if you were truly leak, put the phone numbers of the guys who work on those components response. But DropWizard requires that you put this stuff in as part of your project. This is just some config stuff for the configuration, the templates, which I'm not really using at this point. That's basically it for the core of DropWizard.
So there's the automatic JSON object mapping, but can you also directly return your own JSON objects?
Yes.
And another thing, there seems to be the philosophy that you don't need any dependency injection framework when using DropWizard.
No, they're saying BYO DI. So you could bring in Spring if you wanted, or you could bring in Juice if you wanted, and that's on my to-do list is to add in some Juice sample stuff. But I want to look at how because part of what, let me show you something really quick. So a lot of the stuff over here is in the resources. So here I've got Angular, the core app, Bootstrap, and then you'll note that there's these YAML files. And so these are setting the config. And so the Bootstrap, when you bootstrap it, you remember how it picked up those args off your main? So the one value that you're adding in is which config file do you want to use. So depending on which config file you're using, you'll note I swap around the logging levels a little bit. So I believe that might be a place where I'm going to put some of my config stuff that I want to leverage for DI. Right? So some of this is just part of standard Maven-y stuff. So for example, I'm using Markdown to start adding in the documentation. And then here I've got a test suite. So this test code, I'm actually bootstrapping up DropWizard inside the app. It's inside this. So this is actually basically an integration test, but I'm just able to do the whole integration test as just a rule that I add in. So here I'm saying, hit the page, got a little extra log statement with the smoke work, just because I like to watch my logs out, get bigger. And then I'm doing some assertions on the service test, And I'm also doing I do both leveraging the JSON auto stuff here as well as just looking at straight strings. Because again, these are just sort of hello world tests, and I've got my own logback. So if we go over here, and you know my demo is awesome if the highlight is watching a Maven build run, but here it is in test. Yeah, scroll. Okay, so what's cool is when it's running this part here, it's actually bootstrapping up the server and executing requests against it as part of that test. Now, it's a little bit slow because I'm actually on this implementation I have right here, firing up and tearing down the server every test. So it's slow because I'm doing that. It's fast if you think about how fast it's bringing them up and shutting down that server every time. One of the guys at Dynacron's actually already written and posted a different way of integrating the test suite where it just fires up the server once at the beginning of the integration test, and then once it gets up, it's a lot faster. So.
How large is the artifact?
How large is the artifact? That was excellent. So
That's one issue with frameworks. Let's say Play, your minimum Hello World application is like 60 megabytes.
yeah, so so this is the package. And so what the package does, I don't know if you guys are familiar with shaded jars or not. So everything that's listed as a dependency in my POM, that's a runtime dependency, so not tests and not provided, gets sucked into one jar file by shade. So that's what this is doing, is it's telling you, okay, these are all the things that I'm sucking into this one jar file. So you'll know a bunch of these dependencies that I'm sucking in are ones that I added, not ones that came along with DropWizard. So now we have this. Let's see. So was that 10 meg?
The upper one.
Yeah, the top one.
Yeah,
Yeah, because what it does is it builds. What Shade does is it takes and builds. So there's the jar that's my code, which is the 1 meg, and then it's also all those libraries bundled in. You get 10. But keep in mind that I didn't have to drag all those in, right? I had a whole bunch of dependencies in there, so and I'm not personally interested in doing things like writing my own Mongo driver just so I can avoid having to drag in the library. At some point, you just have to kind of suck it up.
Yeah, 10 megabytes. That's okay.
Yeah. So, let's see now, what else? Yeah.
Are you using Shade to like rename dependencies? I mean, that's what Shade is.
What Shade does is it takes all those jars and merges it into one Uber jar.
Yeah, why use Shade instead of just the standard packaging?
Package only creates the artifact that includes the assets for your code.
No, I mean the jar of dependencies, where you build the jar of dependencies from
That's a good
packaging.
question. Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to look into the jar of packaging.
Shade's cool because if you have conflicting libraries, like you pull in, you have dependencies with transitive libraries with conflicting versions or something, it'll move them out of the way and it'll rename conflicting libraries, so you can actually have two versions of Apache blah in your Uber jar, but it'll rename the packages and move them out of the way so they don't conflict.
I can't figure if that's cool or scary.
It's scary. It's scary what it does.
Yeah.
It's really nice if you're like producing a library jar for other people to use, and you're just like internally using yet another like XML library, whatever, and you don't want to mess up people's class paths, right?
Yeah, there's some of the code obfuscation libraries used to do cool stuff like that too, rename things or say this is my public API, and anything that I'm not declaring as public, I want to scramble it.
It's just a temporary fix until everyone is using OSGI.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh man, I could have put OSGI up on it. All right. So just a couple other things. Here is, so this is the developer dumb HTML file, right? Here's the JSON service running. Here is Bootstrap, which I just am in the process now of integrating the template in. If you haven't seen Bootstrap before, this responsive design stuff is really slick. this is all stuff that just comes from that template. And then as I make it smaller, you'll note that it reformats everything nicely. The header. It's perfect for mobile, absolutely perfect. Because what it does is it's dynamically resizing the application no matter what layout I'm using. That's the whole point of responsive design.
The latest version of Bootstrap was done like mobile first. So it's more like, will it also work on your desktop browser?
Right, so I have this little utility here. So this is the width for old iPhone. Here's low-end Windows. Here is, let's see, I think that's a landscape iOS.
Chrome has a thing for the same.
Yeah. So you can see as I'm flipping around in here, and it's just resizing. And that's part of where, like, what we have come to is the point now where we can't even think about the screen size anymore because there's too many screen size types. So you have to go with something like a responsive model. The principle underneath this is that you have basically you design your mobile first, and then you add in breakpoints. So you see how, like, when I pop that width, that's called a CSS breakpoint, and that allows me to build out a design that has different tiers. And I'm going through it. There's a book, I think it's Responsive to Design. It's really good. It covers all this stuff. And there's a bunch of little tricks like how to get images to work. Hilariously enough, one of the strategies is you actually continue to do div layouts, but then you set the div layouts to table formatting, which I find that hilarious. But
The people who say that with a straight face are the ones that are the most hilarious. So I'm not using tables anymore. Well, you're using table style everywhere. So
Well, but there's a good reason for that, and that's that the CSS doesn't leak out.
right. Well, and that's the thing, right? But it's like you know, for years I felt like I was able to get these nice layouts with tables, and then all these guys all the cool kids are like, no, you got to use divs for everything. And so now to be back to where they're now setting the divs to use table layout underneath, it's like, really, seriously? But you know, whatever. You get old, it all comes around in circles.
have you spent much time with Foundation?
No, I've seen it. It looks cool, but and that gets into this whole what do you pick? The mind share seems to be around Twitter Bootstrap.
So my experience with Twitter Bootstrap was that it was all very interesting. Some of the layout bits are sort of contrary to what I would have picked, but that it is very antagonistic to some of the more recent luminaries' notions on how you should do responsive design and object oriented CSS and all of that stuff. It fights them quite strenuously. I think that means it's going to lose in the long term.
What, Bootstrap or?
Yes. If you're already using Bootstrap, go for it. But, and then the other problem is everybody's Bootstrap app looks exactly identical.
Yeah.
So if you start, so what I've been telling people is if you
remove the
start a
black bar.
if you start a Bootstrap app today, don't be surprised if people are making fun of you by the time you ship for looking exactly like everybody else.
There's nothing wrong with looking like everyone else.
Well, I think part of it is like don't download the template and then just put your
Yeah.
name in the company and then be like, yeah, it's ready to ship. You know, but that's where like you get a lot of that. And with this crew, there's a lot of the hipsters who knock off something really quick in their coffee shop and then they ship it, and that's where you get this like every site it's like the same Bootstrap site. So I don't know if there is a value to going through and rebuilding because the votes were really, really clear as to what people liked when we did it before. We pitched, Nimrit and I pitched DropWizard pretty hard. So let's try, we'll do this one. Who would at least try DropWizard? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So cool. Who's still finished spring MVC? That's where I want to be. We have 15 people raise their hands. That was their pick. Would this still be your pick?
Well, I
I know
think that, but I mean, my mind says it's like Greenfield is not reality to me. I always have restrictions of some sort, and I can conceive of using Spring MVC in those environments, but I can't really conceive of using DropWizard in an environment like the one I'm working in now.
Okay, so the Greenfield call it Poppy Project.
Yeah, I mean, there'd be too many difficulties in selling that.
Yeah, I would say that right now, if I was gonna guess, the work that we're doing is about 1/3 Greenfield, about 2/3 cleanup. You know, there was somebody who said something like, you know, legacy code is code without tests. Right? And so, yeah, this one's,
But it's not just legacy code, it's legacy environments. You may be creating a brand new project, but you're stuck with the restrictions of how the operations has to work, what you can do, what, you know, all kinds of different things. The DropWizard, I think, tries to do too many things, in my mind, that I wouldn't be able to do.
well, the whole premise was Greenfield, right?
Right, I know.
Yeah, and I think that even there, you may not work there forever, right? At some point, you may want to go someplace else, right? Bill, we talked about that. Anyway, I don't think it's worth taking the time to go through the revote because I think these were really big numbers, very clear as to where people were at, which is I think really interesting. And this one clearly is an area. I know that a lot of you guys are back end, and that's what you focus on. It is still worth taking the time to go through and learn some of the stuff to work to talk to the front end folks. Any other questions?
What about like applying DropWizard in like larger enterprise solution? Like, well, I don't know, like what you kind of talked about with like having lots of services out there.
We use DropWizard today with very large companies using very large services, and we've perf-loaded the hell out of it, so we know it scales. So, and then as far as hooking that into the rest of enterprise stuff goes, you can use DropWizard with Spring, and that gives you a nice way to access a bunch of, it's like, oh, how do I talk to my LDAP service? Bring in Spring, use that, whatever. So there's ways to tie these things together. Cool.
What about connecting in MongoDB? Is that a drop-in, or is there a lot of wiring you have to do?
So what I'm doing on mine is I'm just using standard driver interfaces and MongoJack, which is the Mongo Jackson integration stuff, and that's basically it. So Jackson's just kind of like the standard thing now for JSON stuff that's sort of everywhere. And so the combination of those things gives me a really simple. It's super easy to do the queries and get the data set back. All that stuff's cake. Honestly, the thing with Mongo that I found is that the production, taking it into production is harder because of all the clustering stuff, but the developer side is like, and if you go back and you watch the Mongo NoSQL presentation that we did earlier this year, we got a whole presentation with me and some of the guys on the team. So you can see more about what it looks like.
So with any NoSQL databases in Docker, so like the hello world is easy, but don't you completely need to like re-architect your application and change how you're looking because you're storing your data very denormalized. If you're updating things, you may not have proper support for transactions for updating separate denormalized bits.
They're
So
all
you need to
different.
put in like all the compensating transaction bits and the ability to like rebuild everything from scratch.
So they're just different, right?
That's all different. You don't need to do that with like a SQL. So how do you?
Correct. We have stuff that so each package is different, right? So Neo has which is graph, has real transactional stuff in it. Mongo, their concept of transaction is document update, beginning, middle, and end, right? So then you have to do some Xbuild around it. Everyone's package is different. That's a whole other presentation. You should talk to them about
The document update stuff in Mongo is terrifying, I think is the word for it, because it's not ACID at all.
No.
So you have to do a read, update, write. And if anybody else was in the middle of doing a write, and you do your read, update, write, you blow away the additions that the previous person did, even though you're doing the atomic document update.
You have to
redo. There are ways to write fields through, but if you didn't realize that when you were writing it, now you have to go back and rewrite all of your commit logic.
But
There's no way to know when you're done, which is the worst kind of library change that I run into. If I can't tell when I'm done, then it was a bad decision to go with.
Yeah.
It's like adding security to your app later, right? When are you done adding security to your app? I don't know. When the QA people stop screaming at you, right? That's when I'm done.
So I'll mention that one of my concerns about using some of these JSON bindings is that when you start thinking about using JSON for persistence, which is what Mongo's all about. And you start saying, oh yes, I actually have to morph JSON from 5 versions ago that was written, a year ago into the current object, and not having the ability to write custom mappings on an individual object perspective as opposed to the framework level.
So, I mean, for what it's worth, everybody that we talk to, schema management's a pain in the arse, even though typically we don't have anything that's, it's a huge issue. Mongo has strategies for how you deal with it, Neo has strategies, they're really different. So you have to come in, if you're looking at Mongo, for example, since we were talking about that one, you have to read the docs and understand how the hell it works, how it was built, what the principles are behind it. Frankly, just the same way that you would learn to do mess, right? I've been on some stuff that was hellacious trying to get the Spring transactional stuff working, which you think are out of the box. Yeah, it's a couple annotations, right? How bad can it be? Boom, total nightmare, right? So, this stuff, this could be a whole presentation just on, NoSQL packages, which ones scale, which ones are appropriate for which scenarios, what query type, querying, because they all have very different premises for what you're trying to do, right? Like, Mongo is assuming that you're working with these documents. If you were trying to do stuff, like we do on one of our projects right now, what we're doing is we store stuff in Mongo for docs, and that's all mostly static, it's mostly read traffic. And we have these graph associations that we're using Neo to tie everything together. And so we use both packages in combination with each other, playing to their strengths. So that's part of why I was hesitant to put some of those up there, because it was almost like, do you want a motorcycle or a Ford pickup truck? And they're almost like, well, it depends on what I'm trying to do, And that's, I think there's another guy here saying the same thing. So it's a whole, we can do a whole talk just on that. So I think we're definitely good for time. Thank you guys so much. This was a lot of fun to do this presentation. I hope this was helpful for you guys. Was this good? Yeah. Thank you guys so much.